Watch till end. My billionaire grandpa left me $27 billion. My parents came back for it. The first time I heard the number, it didn't sound real. 27 billion. It showed up on a single line in a letterhead that smelled faintly like toner and paper glue, the kind of smell you only notice when your hands are too steady for what your eyes are reading. I was sitting across from a lawyer in a quiet office on the 32nd floor of a glass building in Midtown. Outside, January wind cut down the avenues and made the city look sharper than usual. Inside, everything was soft, beige carpet, matte walls, a bowl of wrapped mints no one touched. The lawyer, Ms. Carraway, kept her voice level, like she was reading a grocery list. Mr. Alden Lorne's estate was placed into a trust, she said. You are the primary beneficiary. Alden Lorne. My grandfather, the man most people knew as a headline, a quote or a photo next to a philanthropic check, the kind of man whose name got attached to buildings, hospitals, scholarships, wings of museums. To me, he was the only adult who ever treated me like I wasn't in the way. I didn't react in the way people expect.
I didn't gasp. I didn't ask her to repeat it.
I just looked down at the paperwork, then up at her, because the part I couldn't understand wasn't the number. It was the word primary. I'd been raised like I belonged to the margins, a quiet kid in secondhand clothes, taught to stay small and grateful. My parents had made an art out of absence. They didn't vanish in a dramatic way. They just left. Slowly, casually, like people slipping out of a party without saying goodbye. When I was 13, my mom told me she needed time. My dad said he had opportunities. Both phrases meant the same thing. I was no longer part of their plan. I ended up with my grandfather for a while until he couldn't have me full-time without setting off a war he didn't want to fight. Not because he was afraid of them, he wasn't. Because he understood something I didn't at 13. The most dangerous people aren't the ones who yell. They're the ones who smile while they take. So the compromise was custody on paper, a private school scholarship in my name, and a series of monthly checks sent to my parents for my support. Officially, I stayed in their home. In reality, I bounced between my grandfather's townhouse, a small apartment he owned for staff, and the quiet corners of my own life. I learned early how to survive without asking for anything, which is why, years later, at 24, sitting in that office, I didn't let the number pull me out of myself. I kept my face neutral. I asked questions. What exactly is in the trust? I said. Ms. Carraway slid a folder closer. A controlling interest in Lorne Holdings, a portfolio of private equity assets, real estate, and liquid accounts. There are charitable commitments. There are conditions. And there is a management structure. She paused, then added, there are also safeguards. I read the words like they might change if I looked away. Alden Lorne had died 3 weeks earlier, quietly, in his sleep, in a hospice suite overlooking the river. The news had broken the next morning. There had been tributes from CEOs and senators, glossy photo reels of him at ribbon cuttings. People called him visionary, titan, legend. I watched those clips on my phone, alone in my apartment, volume low, not because I was devastated in a cinematic way, but because grief, for me, always came as a dull pressure behind the ribs. I hadn't been at the hospice, not because I didn't want to be, because no one told me he was at the end. I'd gotten a voicemail from an unknown number the day after he passed. This is Miss Van Crossy's head. Carraway? The voice had said. Mr. Cotto. Lorne named you in his estate plan. Please contact my office. No condolences, just facts. The kind of message you leave when you assume the recipient can handle the truth without cushioning. She was right. What about my parents? I asked, because it was the only question that mattered. Miss Carraway's expression didn't change, but her eyes sharpened slightly, like she'd been expecting it. Your parents are not beneficiaries, she said. There is a separate provision involving them. I waited. A legacy stipend, she continued, modest, fixed, paid out monthly for a defined period. It is not negotiable. It ends if they contest the trust. The room felt quieter. I stared at the folder again, then at the signature at the bottom of a page, my grandfather's handwriting, steady and unmistakable. He'd always signed cards the same way, no flourish, no wasted lines. He'd thought this through. I should have felt safe in that moment, knowing he'd built walls around whatever he left me. Instead, what I felt was something else, a sense of timing. Like the first domino had fallen, because my parents hadn't called me in years. Not on birthdays, not on holidays, not when I graduated, not when I moved, not when I worked 3 jobs in a row to pay my way through school because I refused to ask anyone for help. They hadn't called until 3 days after the public obituary. My phone rang at 8:17 p.m. on a Tuesday. The contact name was still saved, like a scar. Mom. I stared at it for a full 10 seconds before I answered, not because I needed courage, but because I needed control. I never liked giving people the satisfaction of catching me off guard. "Hello," I said. There was a breath, then a voice that arrived too warm, too polished, like she'd practiced in a mirror. "Oh my God, baby!" Finally, it's me. I didn't correct her. I didn't ask why now. I let her fill the silence with her own choices. "We've been sick about this," she continued. "Just sick. Your grandfather, I can't even—" Her voice wobbled, then steadied quickly, like a switch. "And you must be overwhelmed. We want to be there for you." There it was. The word there said like she had a right to it. My father's voice cut in slightly behind hers, as if, remember, he was supposed to sound like a unit. "Listen," he said, "we need to talk in person. This is family." I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop open, a cheap mug of tea cooling beside it. I had the kind of apartment you get when you prioritize safety over aesthetics. Clean, small, no view. Everything I owned had a purpose. I looked at my phone, then at the calendar on my screen. Tuesday, January 6th. I nodded it without thinking. Dates mattered to me. They always had. "We can talk," I said. "What do you want to talk about?" A pause. Then my mother laughed lightly, as if I'd made a joke. "Oh, sweetheart," she said. "Don't be like that."
"You know what? I didn't answer."
My father cleared his throat. "Your grandfather's assets. The company. The estate. We need to make sure everything is handled properly." There was no mention of my grief. No question about how I was doing. No memory shared. Just the thing they came for, presented like it was a responsibility. My mother's voice softened again. "We're flying in! Friday!" "We'll do dinner. Somewhere nice. You shouldn't be alone right now." I pictured them, already preparing their outfits. My mother in a sleek coat. My father in a watch that cost more than my rent. 2 people who loved looking like they belonged in places. "Where are you staying?" I asked. "With friends," she said quickly. "It doesn't matter. We'll pick you up." She didn't ask if I wanted to be picked up. I could feel the shape of their plan without seeing it. They wanted to appear publicly, in a nice restaurant, be seen as grieving, concerned parents. Then, in the controlled setting of linen tablecloths and dim lighting, push me into agreeing to something for the good of the family. It was familiar. When I was 16, my grandfather had tried to set up a college account for me. My parents told everyone he was spoiling me, and that they needed to teach me values. Behind closed doors, they cashed the checks he sent for my education and called it house expenses. When I confronted my mother once, quietly, with a printed bank statement she'd left on the counter, she'd laughed and flicked my forehead like I was a child. "You're so dramatic," she'd said, loud enough for my father to hear. "It's all the same money." "It's family money. Family money." A phrase that meant their money. Now they were back, and I didn't need the lawyer to tell me what they were going to do next. I could already hear it. The speeches about legacy, the pressure, the guilt, dressed as concern. I also knew something else. If my grandfather had left me anything, he'd left me instructions. He'd left a structure. He'd left an exit. But my parents didn't know that yet. "Friday is fine," I said into the phone. Steady, almost neutral. "Text me the restaurant." "Oh, thank God," my mother breathed. "We'll make it special." After we hung up, I sat still for a moment. I didn't pace. I didn't throw anything. I didn't call a friend to vent. I just opened my laptop, created a new folder, and named it Lorne/Jan 2026. Inside it, I made subfolders: calls, texts, emails, receipts, timeline, witnesses. Then I went to my phone settings and turned on call recording through the app I'd used in college to document a landlord dispute. In my state, I was allowed to record if I was part of the conversation. I made sure of it. Next, I opened a note and wrote, January 6th, 8:17 p.m. Mom called. Dad present. Wants to discuss grandfather's assets. Flying in Friday. Dinner request. It wasn't paranoia. It was habit. When you grow up underestimated, you learn to keep your own reality somewhere no one else can rewrite. At 9:03 p.m., a text came in. Mom, so proud of you for being strong. Grandpa would want us together right now. We'll handle everything as a family. I didn't reply. I took a screenshot, dropped it into texts. At 9:11 p.m., another text. Dad, we'll bring some documents for you to sign. It's nothing complicated. Just procedural. I stared at that one a little longer. Documents. For me to sign? 3 days after the obituary, I didn't feel panic. I felt clarity. I saved it, added it to the folder. Then I wrote one more line in my timeline. January 6th, 9:11 p.m. Dad mentions documents to sign. On Friday, I knew they would show up polished and smiling, speaking in that practiced tone people use when they're about to ask for something they don't deserve. And I knew I would do what I'd always done. I would sit quietly. I would let them talk. I would let them underestimate me, because the truth didn't need my emotion to survive. It just needed time. I closed my laptop, washed my mug, and set my phone face down on the table like it was just another object. In the dark window, my reflection looked calm. I stayed that way on purpose. And when my parents walked back into my life for $27 billion, I made one decision without telling anyone. I wasn't going to stop them from trying. I was going to let them show me exactly who they still were, while I collected everything they didn't realize they were giving me. The next morning, Ms. Carraway emailed me a calendar invite for a second meeting. Subject line, Trust Activation and Protected Provisions. And beneath it, one sentence that felt like my grandfather's voice translated into legal language. We strongly recommend you do not sign anything presented by third parties until after we meet. I looked at the date. The meeting was scheduled for Monday. My parents' dinner was Friday. I didn't change either appointment. I just saved the email, added it to my folder, and sat back. Because now there was a delay, and in that delay the stakes were about to climb. On Friday at 6:12 p.m., my mother texted me a photo of a private dining room, crystal glasses, a view of the skyline, my name on a little printed card at the table. Mom, we reserved the room. We have so much to discuss. Don't be late. I stared at the message, then at the timestamp, and I smiled once, small, brief, to myself. Not because it was funny, because it was perfect. They were building a stage, and they had no idea what I was bringing with me. The restaurant was louder than it looked in the photo, not with noise. Music was low, voices controlled, but with intent. Every table felt like a performance. My parents chose places like this on purpose, somewhere public enough to behave, private enough to apply pressure. They were already seated when I arrived. My mother stood first, arms open, smile wide, the kind that showed teeth but never reached her eyes. There you are, she said loud enough for the neighboring tables to hear. Look at you! She kissed the air near my cheek. My father rose more slowly, smoothing his jacket, eyes scanning me in a way that felt more like inventory than concern. We sat. Wine appeared without asking. My mother waved away the menu. We ordered for you, she said. You used to love sea bass. I didn't correct her. I hadn't eaten fish in years. For the first 20 minutes, they played their roles carefully, stories about my grandfather that centered them, anecdotes where they were generous, patient, misunderstood. My mother dabbed her eyes with a linen napkin, careful not to smudge her makeup. He was complicated, she said. Brilliant, but difficult. You know how he could be. I nodded once. Neutral.
Listening.
My father leaned in. He trusted us with a lot, you know, even when things were strained. That was the opening. I could feel it like a shift in air pressure. My mother sighed, which is why this whole situation is confusing. The lawyers haven't been clear. They won't even return our calls. She looked at me, concern sharpened into expectation. We just want to make sure things are handled correctly, my father added. That's all. The food arrived, plates arranged like art. I ate slowly. I always did when people were trying to rush me. Eventually, my father reached into his leather briefcase and placed a thin folder on the table between us. He didn't slide it toward me yet. Just let it sit there, like a promise. These are standard documents, he said. Power of attorney. Temporary. Just until everything settles. My mother smiled. It'll take so much pressure off you, sweetheart. You've never had to deal with this kind of responsibility. I looked at the folder, then at them. What responsibility? I asked. My father chuckled softly. Managing assets, board communications, media inquiries. You don't want that on your shoulders. I thought about the email from Miss Carraway. Protective provisions. I'm not signing anything tonight, I said calmly. The smile on my mother's face tightened, just slightly. Of course, she said. Not tonight, but soon. These things move fast. She reached out and rested her hand over mine, squeezing gently, a gesture that looked loving from a distance. You trust us, don't you? I didn't answer immediately. I let the silence stretch just long enough to make them uncomfortable, but not enough to seem defiant. I want to understand everything first, I said. That's all. My father nodded, a little too quickly, naturally. The rest of dinner passed with forced ease. They talked about flights, about reconnecting, about being a family again. My mother suggested I stay with them while they were in town. My father mentioned introducing me to the right people. I declined everything politely. When we stood to leave, my mother hugged me tightly, her voice low near my ear. Don't let lawyers scare you, she whispered. They work for whoever pays them. I felt that one settle into place. Outside, the city was cold and bright. I watched them walk toward their waiting car, my father handing a valet a folded bill without looking at him. My mother already on her phone, probably texting someone about how well it went. They thought they'd laid groundwork. They didn't realize they'd given me more. Back home, I didn't unwind.
I worked. I uploaded the call recordings from earlier in the week.
Labeled them with dates and timestamps. I typed a detailed account of the dinner while the memory was still clean. Exact phrases, gestures, who said what first. At 10:46 p.m., an email came in from my mother. Subject: Next steps. We're so glad we talked tonight. Your dad and I spoke with our advisor, and we think it would be best if you came by the hotel tomorrow morning so we can go over a few things calmly. No pressure, just clarity. Love you. I saved it. The next morning, I met Ms. Carraway again. This time, there was another man in the room, older, silver-haired, introduced as Mr. Havelock. He didn't smile. Your grandfather anticipated this, he said after listening to my summary, which is why the trust includes a behavioral contingency. I leaned forward slightly. What kind of contingency? He slid a document across the table. Not the will. Something else. A conditional forfeiture clause, he said. If any individual attempts to coerce, mislead, or induce you into relinquishing control of trust assets, documented evidence of such attempts triggers a review. A review by whom? I asked.
By the trustees, Miss Carraway said.
And potentially by regulators. I looked at the page. Dense legal language, precise, unforgiving. What happens if it's triggered? I asked. Mr. Havelock met my eyes. Access is frozen. Stipends are suspended, and prior transfers can be audited retroactively.
Retroactively.
I thought about college funds that never reached me, about checks labeled support that paid for cars and vacations. How far back? I asked. Up to 20 years, he said. I didn't smile. I didn't need to. Do nothing, Miss Carraway added. Let them keep talking. They did. Over the next week, my parents grew bolder. Texts became instructions. Calls became lectures. My father sent emails from an address I hadn't seen before, looping in people he referred to as our team. One email included a spreadsheet titled Transition Plan. Another included a calendar invite for a family meeting at a private club. I accepted nothing. I replied to almost nothing. When I did, it was brief, non-committal. Calm, meanwhile, I collected. I requested copies of old bank records through channels my grandfather had quietly left open to me, accounts in my name that had been drained, transfers justified as reimbursements. I cross-referenced dates with tuition invoices I'd paid myself. Patterns emerged. One afternoon, as I was scanning a batch of PDFs, I found something that made me stop. A wire transfer confirmation from 12 years ago. Amount, $480,000. From Alden Lorne Educational Trust to an account under my mother's maiden name memo. Emergency academic housing. I pulled my housing records from that year. My lease, my rent, $900 a month. Number emergency, no relocation. I kept digging. 3 more transfers. Different memos, same destination. I built a timeline! Highlighted discrepancies. Saved everything. But it wasn't until the following Friday, exactly 2 weeks after the dinner, that I found the thing that changed the shape of everything. It was buried in an old email archive my grandfather's assistant had kept, a forwarded message chain labeled simply, FYI. The original sender was my father, the recipient, my grandfather. The subject line, regarding my name. I opened it. Alden, we need to revisit the arrangement. The current setup is inefficient and, frankly, doesn't need the full allocation. We're redirecting some of the funds temporarily. This is in everyone's best interest. We'll account for it later, D. My grandfather's reply came 3 minutes later. Do not touch money. Designated for my grandchild again. This is not a suggestion. Below that, a follow-up from my father sent 6 months later. Understood. We've adjusted how it's classified. I stared at the screen for a long time. Because classification mattered, and because now I had proof, not just of misuse, but of intent, of defiance, of deception dressed up as management. I saved the email chain, dropped it into receipts. Then I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes. My parents thought they were negotiating from a position of authority. They didn't know they were standing on a ground my grandfather had already mined. The next message from my mother arrived an hour later. Mom, we're hosting a small gathering next weekend. Friends, family, people who care about legacy. It would mean so much if you came. We can announce some things together. I read it twice. A public setting, an announcement. They were planning something big. I didn't reply right away. I forwarded the message to Miss Caraway instead with a single line, "They're setting the stage." Her response came 10 minutes later. Good. So are we. I closed my laptop and looked out the window at the city below, lights flickering on as evening settled in. They wanted an audience. They were about to get one. And this time, I had the receipt that made everything else inevitable. The invitation arrived 3 days later, printed on heavy cream cardstock and delivered by courier. My mother's handwriting curved across the envelope, deliberate and familiar, like she wanted to remind me she still knew how to make things look personal. Inside was a formal announcement. Lorne Legacy Reception. Private event Saturday 7 p.m. The Whitaker Club number RSVP line. No question mark. Just expectation. The Whitaker Club was one of those places people used to prove they belonged. Old money walls, discreet security, a guest list that functioned like a resume. My parents had never been members on their own merit. My grandfather had sponsored them years ago, back when he still believed proximity might improve character. I knew what this was. They were going to present themselves as stewards of my grandfather's empire, frame me as the quiet heir who needed guidance. Announce a transition. Possibly even unveil a foundation or advisory board with themselves at the center. And they were doing it publicly, with witnesses who mattered. I accepted the invitation that afternoon. No comment. No conditions. Just, yes. From that moment on, I stopped responding to everything else. The calls increased. My mother left long voicemails, her tone shifting between affection and mild irritation. My father sent texts reminding me of optics and responsibility. One message included a photo of the club's main hall already being prepared. Dad, this is bigger than you! Don't complicate it! I saved it! The week leading up to Saturday moved slowly, on purpose. I met twice more with Miss Caraway and the trustees. We didn't rehearse speeches. We didn't strategize theatrics. We reviewed documents, we confirmed timelines, we verified authenticity. Everything had to be clean. What happens if they deny it? I asked during the last meeting. They won't, Mr. Havelock said. Not with this. He tapped the folder lightly. And if they try to spin it? I asked. Mrs. Carroway looked at me. You won't respond.
We will. That was the plan.
I wouldn't argue. I wouldn't explain. I would present facts, then step back. Friday night, my mother sent one final message. Mom, wear something nice. This is your night too. I didn't open it until the next morning. Saturday came clear and cold. I dressed simply. Dark suit, no tie. Watch my grandfather had given me when I graduated. Nothing flashy, nothing that could be accused of performance. At 6:58 p.m., I walked into the Whitaker Club. The room was already full. Low conversation hummed beneath soft lighting. Crystal glasses caught the light. A string quartet played near the windows. I recognized faces from articles and charity boards, people who understood money and power even if they pretended not to care about either. My parents stood near the center, radiant. My mother wore ivory. My father looked relaxed in a way he rarely did, like he believed the night was already won. When they saw me, my mother's smile widened. She took my arm immediately, guiding me through the room. There you are, she said brightly. Everyone's been asking. She introduced me again and again, always with the same framing. This is our child, so private, so thoughtful. We've been helping with the transition. Helping. Each time she said it, I noted who heard it. Board members, donors, journalists pretending not to be journalists. I said very little. Nodded, shook hands. Let them talk. At 7:30, my father tapped a glass. The room quieted. He stepped onto the small raised platform near the fireplace. My mother joined him, hand resting lightly on his arm. They looked practiced. Comfortable.
Thank you all for coming, my father began.
This evening is about honoring Alden's legacy and ensuring it continues with integrity. Polite applause. As many of you know, he continued, our family has been deeply involved in stewarding these assets for years. I watched faces. Some nodded, some listened carefully. And while grief is personal, my mother added softly, legacy is communal. More applause. They spoke for 10 minutes. About philanthropy, about continuity, about values. My name came up only in passing, always paired with words like support and guidance. Finally, my father gestured toward me. And now, he said, we'd like to formally introduce the next phase. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a document. Held it up. This outlines the advisory structure we'll be implementing, he said. With your support, there it was. He hadn't asked me. He hadn't even looked at me. He was announcing control, as if it were already agreed upon. I felt no rush of adrenaline, no heat, just a narrowing of focus. I stepped forward, not onto the platform, just close enough to be seen. I haven't agreed to that, I said calmly. The room stilled. My mother's hand tightened on my father's arm. My father smiled, a practice thing.
Of course.
This is just a formality. It's not, I said, still calm. And it's not accurate. A ripple moved through the crowd. Not shock. Interest. This isn't the time, my mother murmured, her voice tight but sweet. It is, I said. I reached into my jacket and pulled out my phone. Not dramatically, just like someone checking a note. I was named primary beneficiary, I said, solely. Silence. My father's smile flickered. That's not, he began. I also hold controlling interest, I continued. Effective immediately. Someone near the front inhaled sharply. I didn't want to discuss this publicly, I said. But since announcements are being made on my behalf, accuracy matters. I nodded once toward the side of the room. Miss Carroway stepped forward. She hadn't been introduced. She didn't need to be. Good evening, she said. I represent the Lorne Trust. She held a slim folder, opened it. There have been attempts, she continued evenly, to misrepresent the structure of this estate and to pressure the beneficiary into relinquishing control. My mother laughed lightly. This is absurd! Ms. Carroway didn't look at her. As of this afternoon, she said, The trustees initiated a formal review under the trust's protective provisions. The word review landed heavily. What review? My father asked, his voice sharper now. Miss Carraway turned a page. Regarding unauthorized transfers from accounts designated for the beneficiary, she said, dating back 12 years. The room shifted. People leaned in. Phones appeared discreetly. My mother's face drained of color. That's a mistake, she said quickly. There is documentation, Miss Fraze and Miss Fries, and recording, Carraway said. Wire confirmations, email correspondence, memos. She looked up for the first time, meeting my father's eyes. Would you like me to read them? My father didn't answer. I stayed where I was, hands relaxed at my sides. I didn't need to add anything. The air felt tight now, like everyone was holding their breath. This is a family matter, my mother said louder now. You're embarrassing us. I looked at her then, really looked. This isn't about embarrassment, I said. It's about records. Miss Carraway closed the folder. Effective immediately, she said. All stipends under the legacy provision are suspended pending audit. Any public statements made tonight mischaracterizing the estate will be corrected. The silence that followed was absolute. I could hear the quartet stop playing. My father opened his mouth, then closed it. His confidence had evaporated, replaced by calculation. This wasn't a conversation anymore. It was a process. I took one step back. I didn't come here to argue, I said. I came because I was invited. I glanced around the room once, at the faces now watching my parents instead of me. I think everything that needs to be said has been said. And with that, I stopped talking. Behind me, Miss Carraway opened the folder again. Now, she said, we can begin with the first transfer. And as she spoke the date out loud, I realized something important. This wasn't exposure yet. This was just the opening line. The real consequences were about to start unfolding, right here, in front of everyone they'd tried so hard to impress. And I didn't move. I just waited. Miss Carraway didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. June 14th. 12 years ago, she said, reading from the document, a wire transfer of $480,000 from the Alden Lorne Educational Trust to an account held under Margaret Hale's maiden name. My mother shook her head, a sharp, almost involuntary motion. That was reimbursed. That was cleared. Ms. Carraway turned a page. There is no record of reimbursement, she said. There is a memo stating emergency academic housing. A pause. The beneficiary's housing records for that year show no emergency relocation, no change of residence, and no expense exceeding $900 per month. Someone in the crowd shifted. Glass clinked softly. My father stepped forward, forcing a laugh that landed flat. This is completely inappropriate, he said. You're misinterpreting internal family transfers. Ms. Carraway looked up and said, Then you won't mind the audit. That word again? Audit. It changed the temperature of the room, she continued. August 3rd, $220,000. Classified as educational support. Same destination account. She didn't rush. She let each date breathe. Each number sit long enough to be absorbed. Phones were no longer discreet. No one was pretending not to record. This is character assassination, my mother said, louder now. You're turning grief into spectacle. I finally spoke again, not to contradict her, but to clarify something important. No, I said evenly, you did that when you announced control you didn't have. My father turned toward me, eyes sharp. You're being manipulated. I met his gaze without flinching. I've reviewed everything, I said. Twice, Miss Carraway continued. There is also correspondence, she said, in which Mr. Hale was explicitly instructed to stop redirecting funds. She read my grandfather's email aloud. The exact words. No commentary. Do not touch money designated for my grandchild again. When she finished, she looked up. That instruction was ignored. The silence afterward wasn't shock anymore. It was recalculation. People weren't looking at me with pity or curiosity now. They were looking at my parents with a new kind of distance, the kind reserved for liability. A man I recognized from a foundation board cleared his throat. Are regulators involved? He asked. Miss Sarah? Caraway nodded once. They will be. My mother reached for my arm. I stepped away before she could touch me. You don't understand, she said, her voice thinning. We raised you. We sacrificed. You redirected funds meant for my education, I said, while telling me there was nothing left. That landed harder than any accusation. My father's composure finally cracked. This is a misunderstanding, he said sharply. We can resolve this privately. Miss Caraway closed the folder. This is private, she said. You chose to make it public. She turned slightly, addressing the room. All statements made tonight regarding governance of the Lorne estate were inaccurate. A formal correction will be issued tomorrow. Any contracts or announcements implied here have no standing. A murmur spread. My parents stood very still. They were no longer hosts. They were subjects. I didn't stay to watch the full collapse. I didn't need to. I nodded once to Miss Caraway, then walked toward the exit. No rush. No drama. Behind me, voices rose. Questions, defenses, denials. I stepped out into the cold night air and breathed. For the first time in weeks, my chest felt light. The consequences unfolded without my involvement. Within 48 hours, the club issued a quiet statement, distancing itself from the event. 2 charities my parents sat on boards for announced temporary leaves pending review. A business partner withdrew from a joint venture to reassess alignment. The audit moved forward. Accounts were frozen. Records requested. Lawyers hired. My parents called, left messages, sent emails that swung wildly between anger and apology. I didn't respond, not out of spite, out of boundaries. On Monday, I met with the trustees again. Recovery is possible, Mr. Havelock said. Not all of it, but a significant portion.
That's fine, I said. Proceed.
And your parents? Miss Caraway asked. I thought for a moment. The trust stipulates what happens, I said. Follow it, she nodded. No judgment, just process. That afternoon, I went to my grandfather's townhouse for the first time alone. The place was quiet. Sunlight cut across the hardwood floors. His books were still where he'd left them. Notes tucked into margins. Receipts folded neatly in drawers. In his study, I found a single envelope on the desk. My name on it. No date. Inside was a short note, handwritten. If you're reading this, it means I was right to wait. You were always paying attention. That matters. I sat there for a long time, not grieving loudly, not celebrating, just understanding. My parents eventually stopped calling. The stipend ended just as the trust said it would. I heard through other people that they were shocked, that they never expected this, that they did everything for me. I didn't correct the story. I didn't need to. Over the next months, I built a different life. I hired professionals who worked for the trust, not for me personally. I attended board meetings quietly. I asked questions. I listened more than I spoke. I funded the scholarship my grandfather had planned, this time with safeguards that made redirection impossible. I moved apartments, not bigger, just brighter. I slept better. Sometimes people recognized me, asked how it felt. I always gave the same answer. It's a responsibility, I said, not a reward. 'Cause that was the truth. I didn't win anything. I just stopped letting other people take it. And that was enough.